It begins with a step not taken lightly. In the quietest wing of the Apostolic Palace, past frescoed halls that once echoed with footfalls of cardinals and kings, there lies a door with no inscription, no plaque, no sigil, no indication of what sleeps behind it. To those who work above scribes, archivists, and the occasional monk in woolen habit, it is simply called Il Portone, the gate. It has been opened only a handful of times in the past century. Not locked, no. Never locked. That would imply fear. Instead, it remains closed by intention, sealed by the silence of time and dust and reverence. The man who stood before it this evening bore none of the ceremonial robes often associated with the place. He was not a bishop, not a cardinal, not a seeker of forbidden knowledge, though he had once dreamed of being all three. His name was Lucian Aldo, and he was, above all else, patient. He had waited for this moment for years, not to uncover secrets that would topple belief or stir scandal, but to listen. That, he always believed, was the first and final act of true scholarship. And so, he stood still for a moment longer, breathing in the cool scent of old stone and candle smoke, letting the silence settle around his shoulders like a shawl. Then, slowly, he turned the latch. The door opened with no creak, no groan, just a gentle sigh, as though the room beyond had been holding its breath. Lucian stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the air. It was dry, but not lifeless. It had the kind of weight one only finds in places where words had been left unsaid for centuries. The room beyond was not large, not vast or catacombic, as some myths suggested. It was simply deep, as though reality had folded here, in this precise corner of the world, and time had agreed to pause. A narrow corridor stretched ahead, dimly lit by sconces that flickered with real flame. Vatican electrics did not reach this far. These walls were older than wiring, older than blueprints, perhaps even older than the idea of Vatican itself. Lucian moved forward slowly, his soft leather shoes brushing against the stone floor, which had been polished not by tools, but by the passage of invisible feet across centuries. Each step sounded like a page turning. He passed niches in the walls, filled with scrolls sealed in wax. Some bore Latin inscriptions, others Greek, Hebrew, Syriac. One he could not identify at all. The symbols shimmered strangely in the candlelight, almost alive. He did not touch them. Touching was not what he came for. At the end of the corridor, another door awaited this one, wooden, dark, and weathered smooth as driftwood. It bore a simple iron handle and a Latin inscription etched above it. Silentium est lux, silence is light. Lucian paused again. He thought about the stories he'd read, whispers of forbidden texts, of letters written by popes and hidden forever, of books that could undo belief. He had no interest in any of those. The truth, he knew, was always more quiet than legend, more still. If the stories were loud, then the real secret would be soft. He reached for the handle and pulled. The door gave way, and what opened before him was the beginning of the vault beneath silence. Inside, the world changed. There were no aisles, no grand shelves. Instead, the space looked like a cross between a chapel and a cave. High arches supported a ceiling of pale stone, dotted with small alcoves carved directly into the walls, each holding objects not meant to be catalogued, a feather sealed in resin, a stone tablet wrapped in linen, a cup etched with invisible script, a single folded robe made of ash-colored cloth. In the center of the room stood a long stone table. Upon it lay exactly 5 books. Each one had a name engraved not on the cover, but on the stone beneath where it rested. Lucian approached them as if they were sleeping animals. The first book was large and bound in bark, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. Beneath it, the inscription read, Liber Veritas, the Book of Green. The second was smaller, its cover smooth and black as onyx, with no title at all, only the stone beneath it. Nomen nolum, no name. The third was wrapped in cloth, held closed with a silk cord that shimmered oddly in the dim light. The cloth bore faded symbols that Lucien recognized faintly from his studies of pre-Roman cults. Its label read, Evangelium Umbrae, the Gospel of Shadow. He dared not touch it. Instead, he walked to the far end of the table where a thinner, almost fragile book lay open, not closed on a slanted platform, as if inviting the viewer to read. The pages were blank. Completely blank! But as Lucien gazed at the empty parchment, he began to notice something peculiar. The edges of the page shimmered, like heat rising from stone. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, lines began to appear. Not ink, not pigment, more like memory surfacing. The lines curved, formed letters Latin. Yes, but not inscribed in any human hand. They looked like breath frozen onto glass, then slowly fading. He blinked once, and the words were gone again. He sat down on the stone bench across from the book and allowed the silence to settle around him again. He did not try to read further. He simply sat and waited. That was his gift. After all, Lucien had always known how to wait. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time did not move the same here. Eventually, he turned to the final book. This one was enclosed in a glass case. Unlike the others, a thick tome, the size of a kneeling cushion, bound in deep red leather with golden clasps shaped like flames. Beneath the glass, the engraving read, Codex Lux, the Book of First Light. His breath caught. He had heard the name only once, and only in a footnote written in ink, so faded he'd questioned whether he'd imagined it. The Codex Lux, if it truly existed, was believed to be a record not of events but of beginnings. A text that contained no narrative, but rather descriptions of how light came to be understood by the human soul. Lucien did not want to open it. Even the idea felt too loud. So instead, he placed his hand gently on the glass case and closed his eyes. In the silence, something stirred. Not a voice, not a thought, but a warmth, as if the stone beneath him remembered something, and was remembering it again, for him. Hours passed. Lucien did not sleep, nor did he speak. He sat with the books, and the books, it seemed, sat with him. Outside the vault, the world-continued tourists wandered the Sistine Chapel. Cardinals reviewed documents in offices lit by golden lamps, and bells rang in quiet rhythm across Rome. But in the vault there was no hour. Only presence. Only pages that breathed and light that moved not with candles, but with memory. And Lucien, a scholar of no great fame, a man with soft hands and quieter thoughts, became, if only for this one evening, the only person alive who had heard the vault beneath silence. Exhale. He stood, finally, and without looking back, walked slowly back toward the door. He did not take notes. He did not memorize titles. He simply remembered how it felt. And that was more than enough. Lucien returned the next morning. No formal permission had been requested this time. No documentation prepared. No guard notified. He simply passed the same cloistered courtyard as he had the day before, his hands tucked into the folds of his long wool coat, and made his way beneath the quiet corridors toward the vault. No one stopped him. No one looked his way. Perhaps they had forgotten. Or perhaps the library itself had made room for his return, as if it too remembered. The heavy wooden door stood ajar when he arrived. It was neither invitation nor warning, merely inevitability. He stepped inside. And again, the world dimmed. The light shifted as if time thickened around him. Candle flames stilled, and the scent of vellum, stone, and centuries-old parchment welcomed him home like an old shawl laid over the shoulders by unseen hands. Lucien's steps were slower today, more deliberate. He passed the 5 books on the central stone table without touching them. They were not for him today. Not yet. Instead, he turned toward a small archway in the leftmost wall, one he had not noticed the evening before. It was carved in the shape of a keyhole, though no key had ever fit it. A narrow staircase descended behind it, steep and spiraled like a conch shell buried in earth. He hesitated at the first step, just briefly. Then down he went. The air cooled as he descended, not uncomfortably so, but with the gentle chill of underground chambers, long left untouched. The stone beneath his feet had been worn smooth by very few. Even his own footfalls seemed reluctant, hushed by velvet dust clinging to every crevice. There were no lights here, yet somehow he could see. At the base of the stairwell was a simple wooden door, ancient and undecorated. No engraving, no lock. Just a subtle imprint in the grain of the wood, shaped like an open eye. Lucien placed his palm against it, half expecting resistance. But the door gave way. It opened with a breath. And within he found the forbidden index. It was not a grand hall. No towering shelves, no glowing manuscripts, no cryptic artifacts waiting on gilded pedestals. Just a room, a square, stone chamber, no larger than a chapel's vestry. The walls were lined with shallow alcoves, each containing a single volume, no two the same. Some books were bound in cloth, others in wood, or what looked like folded metal. A few lacked bindings entirely, appearing more like bundles of thread or coiled reeds. Each alcove was numbered, but the numbers made no logical sense. They did not ascend. They did not repeat. Some were symbols. One was simply a single dot. At the center of the room sat a small lectern, low to the ground, designed for reading in stillness rather than speed. Upon it lay a slim ledger, leather-bound and cracked at the edges. Lucien sat on the floor beside it and opened the cover gently. The title, handwritten in delicate ink at the top of the first page, read, Index Librorum non illuminandorum, the index of books not to be lit. Below it, in much smaller letters, to be read only by those who remember the silence before language. Lucien exhaled quietly. His breath stirred the dust, which danced like old snowflakes. The ledger was organized alphabetically, but only in a sense. Many entries began with letters he did not recognize. Some had no titles at all. Merely descriptions. A few were listed only by smell or sound or even feeling. He read silently. Entry 01197A. The Chronicle of Echoes. A collection of conversations recorded in a monastery where no one had spoken for 900 years. The text contains only pauses, but they are arranged in a pattern that induces memory of things one has never known. Lucien paused at this one, fingers hovering just above the page. He tried to imagine a book composed of silences, and realized, with a quiet hum in his chest, that he had already held such a book, the open one. Upstairs on the stone table, the one that revealed and erased itself with breath. He turned the page. Entry 0212K. The letters without addressee. Unmailed letters found in the pockets of a long-deceased archivist. Each begins with, to the one who waited. But no two contain the same handwriting. The letters appear to change when read aloud. Lucian made a note in the corner of his mind. Do not read aloud. Not here. He continued. Entry 0371. The Gospel of the Rootless Tree describes the journey of a fig tree that walked the deserts in search of the wind, written in a language that hums when touched, no translation known. Lucian felt an involuntary smile flicker on his lips, not amusement, just resonance. He had always liked trees. And so he read on, page after page, an index of things too quiet to be spoken of. Books that were not dangerous by content, but by presence. Books that did not need to be understood to be remembered. Some appeared only once every few decades. Others vanished when named. A few refused to be seen unless forgotten. He found himself slowing down, not from fatigue, but from a kind of reverence. Each entry was like brushing against the edge of a dream, soft and real, but too fragile to grasp. They passed through his mind like mist. After some time, perhaps minutes, perhaps hours, he came upon a final page. It was blank, except for a single line at the top. What you seek cannot be catalogued. He closed the ledger gently and placed it back on the lectern. There was nothing more to find, or rather, everything more to wait for. Lucian rose. He turned, slowly, and surveyed the alcoves around him once more. This time, he did not look with the eyes of a scholar. He looked with the quiet eyes of someone returning home after a long absence. He was not there to gather, or to claim, or to reveal. He was only there to witness. He stepped to the alcove marked with the single dot. Within it was no book, just a folded piece of cloth. He reached toward it but stopped short of touching. Instead, he leaned in, close enough to see the fine stitching, not letters, not symbols. Just thread woven so tightly it formed what looked like a horizon. He blinked, and for a moment he could hear it. Not with his ears, but somewhere deeper, a quiet rhythm, like breathing, like wind, like the silence before a word. He left the chamber soon after, climbed the stairs slowly, passed through the keyhole-shaped archway once more. The vault received him as before, unchanged. But he had changed. Not dramatically, not outwardly, but within him a shift. He now carried, not knowledge, but a stillness that would follow him into every room, every conversation, every page he ever turned again. Lucian walked to the main stone table and looked again upon the 5 books. They no longer called to him. He bowed gently, not out of worship, but of thanks. And then, without ceremony or noise, he left the vault. When asked weeks later what he had found, he answered only, "An index of things that do not wish to be remembered, and in that forgetting, they become part of us." No one pressed further. Somehow that was enough. There are pages that refuse the light. They do not glow, nor gleam, nor shimmer in candles' flicker. They retreat instead into the folds of shadow pages that exist more fully when eyes close, not open. And in the vault beneath the Vatican, such pages rest patiently, unread by centuries of hands, their stories untouched by flame or filament. These are the lightless pages. Lucian Aldo had not planned to return so soon, but sleep had evaded him ever since he'd turned from the forbidden index. It wasn't unrest that stirred in him, but a gentle kind of echo, like a voice just out of reach, calling not for attention, but remembrance. He woke before dawn, long before the bells of Rome began their sleepy chorus, and dressed without turning on the light. A small oil lamp guided him through the quiet halls. No one stopped him. The Swiss guards knew his face by now, and perhaps some unseen register in the Vatican Library had marked him as one of its own. Again, The great wooden door at the vault's entrance opened with ease. Again, the air felt older than time. But something today was different. A subtle shift. Wait, the scent of wax was stronger. Yet no more candles had been lit. And there was a faint trace of something else, earth, perhaps, or parchment warmed by breath. He followed it slowly, as though led by memory itself. Past the central stone table, past the 5 sacred volumes, toward a part of the vault he had not yet entered. A corridor, barely a body's width across, revealed itself in a crease of the stone wall behind the Codex Lux. The entrance was no more than a vertical slit of darkness easily mistaken for a shadow. But Lucian, now more a part of this place than of the waking world, recognized the invitation for what it was. He stepped inside. The passage was narrow, curving downward like a spiral uncoiling. The light from his small lamp barely reached the floor, but he continued anyway. With each turn, the darkness thickened, not oppressively, but with intention. It was not the absence of light, but the presence of stillness. At last, the passage opened into a low chamber. Lucian paused on the threshold. The room was completely dark, even his lamp, now held aloft, gave off no glow. It still burned. He could feel the warmth, but the light did not spread. It stopped, as if the darkness itself drank it before it could travel. This was the chamber of lightless pages. He stepped forward carefully. The floor felt soft underfoot like densely packed wool or aged cloth. The air was neither warm nor cold, but perfectly still, like the breath before a whisper. No shelves, no desks, only cushions on the floor and books. Books everywhere, laid gently across raised stone pedestals, cradled in soft linen slings that curved upward from the floor, tucked into alcoves whose edges glowed faintly, not with light, but with memory. Lucian extinguished the lamp. He had not planned to. He simply knew. The moment the flame disappeared, his vision changed. Not in color, not in clarity, but in presence. The books were there, not seen but sensed. The way one senses a dream unfolding just before waking, or a story heard long ago returning without context, only rhythm. He moved toward the nearest pedestal and sat cross-legged before it. There was no title, no cover, just pages, slightly opened, curved upward like petals ready to receive rain. He did not touch the pages. Instead, he closed his eyes, and the book began to speak not in words but in warmth. It was the story of a monastery buried beneath a frozen lake, of monks who had vowed not to write but to remember. Each night, they gathered in silence and recited not prayers, but dreams, each man holding a single thread of memory passed down since the first snowfall. The dreams were stored, not in ink but in stone. The walls themselves had been carved with their breath, their stillness, their patience. No pilgrim ever found the monastery. It did not wish to be found. And when the lake thawed 1,000 years later, there was no building left, only the faint impression of walls on the lake bed, and a single stone tablet, too smooth to be natural, lying on the silt like a fallen thought. Lucian opened his eyes. The book had closed itself. He turned to the next one. This one hummed, not aloud but in sensation, as though sound was a texture beneath the skin. He drew closer and once more closed his eyes. The second story was older. It came from a time before ink, of travelers who carried their libraries in their bones. Each person was entrusted with a single tale, not a fable, not a fact, but a rhythm, a way of walking, a cadence of heartbeat, a pattern in breath. Together, as they moved across the steps, their bodies formed living texts. When two tribes met, they would sit in circle, when without speaking, align their pulses. Thus, knowledge was exchanged not in language, but in life. Lucian exhaled slowly. The story faded. He moved again. This time, the book before him had no pages. Only a spiral of fine black thread wound around a stone rod. He reached forward, gently, and let his fingers hover. The thread vibrated, and Lucian, with his eyes closed, was drawn into a third story. This one had no origin, no beginning. It described the memory of the first person who forgot. They had stood before a real tree, and asked its name. The tree did not answer, because it had never known it had one. And in that moment, the person who asked also forgot their own. The forgetting spread like dusk, quiet and complete. And in the silence that followed, new language was born not from knowledge, but from reverence. The words were not sounds, but gestures, the way light touches leaves, the way shadow stretches. This was the first forgetting. Lucian felt tears trace down his cheeks, not from sorrow, but from recognition. He had not understood the story, but it had remembered him. He remained in the chamber for what could have been an entire night. He did not open more than a handful of books, but each one felt less like reading and more like being read. By the time he rose, the darkness had softened. He relit his lamp, and though its light now reached the walls, he no longer needed it. The way back felt shorter, as if the path itself knew he would return. Back in the vault, the 5 great books on the table waited, unchanged. Lucian passed them with a bow. Not deep, just enough to acknowledge the breath between questions. Then he ascended to the outer library. A scribe passing in the hallway nodded politely. Lucian nodded back. No words were exchanged. But something in the air just barely had changed. That evening, Lucian made only one note in his journal. Some pages do not reflect light, but gather it quietly, over centuries. What they give in return is not information, but presence. And in their company, we are not researchers, we are guests. The wind was soft in the alleys of Vatican City that morning. It moved between stone columns like a quiet whisper, stirring nothing but the memory of movement. As the city stirred into light, Lucian Aldo walked alone beneath the cloister arches, his footsteps muffled by worn marble and lingering dust. He had not meant to return so soon, yet here he was again, the shape of sleep still clinging to his eyes, the warm residue of dreams trailing behind his thoughts. He did not speak to anyone. He did not need to. The Vatican Library had a rhythm, and Lucian was learning to follow it like a monk follows the bell. The vault door opened without resistance. The quiet greeted him like a shawl drawn gently over the shoulders. He passed the 5 eternal books at the stone table and the corridor of the lightless pages beyond. He paused briefly at the entrance to that chamber, remembering the strange warmth of unreadable books, but he did not enter today. Instead, he turned left toward a wall he had passed many times but never truly seen. Now it shimmered faintly, not with light but with invitation. The wall was smooth and pale, unmarked by carvings, yet as Lucian approached, a soft impression began to take shape, not in the stone, but in his awareness. It was the faintest outline of a doorway, like the memory of a door once opened. And there, written in a hand that was not carved but felt, were the words, "To enter." Think of a book that does not exist. Lucian stood still for several moments. He did not try to imagine a book. He did not try to name it. He simply closed his eyes and allowed the thought to come. A book that had never been written. A story that had never been told. A memory too quiet to be captured. And just like that, the wall opened. It did not creak or shift or crumble. It simply ceased to be. Lucian stepped forward. The room was round, perfectly round, like the interior of a bell, or the hollow inside a cupped hand. The walls were curved shelves, smooth, seamless, and entirely empty. No books, no scrolls, no writing instruments. Only silence, warm and total. In the center of the room sat a single pedestal. Upon it, nothing. Lucian approached slowly. And then, without prompting, he sat down cross-legged before it just as he had in the chamber of lightless pages. But this room had no darkness. It had no light either. It had only stillness. It had, He waited. No visions came, no words emerged, no phantom voices whispered through the walls. Only breath. Only the faint sound of his own heartbeat, regular and calm. He waited longer. And then, something. Not an image, but a sensation. The feeling of a page being turned, though no page existed. The echo of a quill touching parchment. The pause before a name is spoken, the sacred hesitation between intention and sound. Lucian let go of all expectation. And that was when the story began. It was not told in sentences. It did not begin with "once upon a time," nor did it unfold in any way that resembled a tale. Instead, the feeling came. A child sitting in a field watching ants carry leaves. The heat of summer on the back of the neck. The smell of earth, disturbed gently by wind. A mother's hand brushing dirt from a brow wordlessly. No names, no events. Only fragments of presence. Then more. A monk alone in a tower, turning a page he cannot read because it was written in the dark by a hand now lost to time. The brush of vellum beneath calloused fingers. The sound of breath echoing in a circular stone room. A whisper, never spoken, still ringing after 100 years. And then silence. Not absence, but the fullness of something never begun. Lucian understood. The book before him, the one he could not see, could not touch, could not name, was a collection of moments too quiet for memory. It held everything that was left unsaid. He sat for what might have been hours, or centuries, in that chamber. At some point, the feeling faded not because it was gone, but because it had passed through him. He stood slowly. The room had not changed. Still round, still empty, still full. He bowed just slightly, not out of ritual, but in gratitude. And as he turned to leave, a new line had appeared on the pedestal, not written, but simply there. This book does not need pages, for it is already written into you. Lucian smiled and walked out. The wall closed behind him, though he did not see it. He returned to the vault with no souvenirs, no scrolls, no secrets. Only the gentle knowing that somewhere, in a room with no books, he had read something and in doing so, had been read. He did not write in his journal that night. Instead, he sat in his small room in the scholar's residence, candle unlit, eyes half closed, and allowed the silence to continue. That night, he slept without dreams. There are names that never appear in records, yet their fingerprints remain on every page. There are hands that never held ink, yet every shelf remembers them. In the quietest corners of the Vatican Library, there are traces of a person no one recalls, and yet everything within the oldest vaults bears his pattern. He is not listed among the scribes, the monks, or the protectors. There is no mention in any birth register, death record, or clerical archive. And yet, without him, the vault would be unreadable. Lucian Aldo first noticed the presence when he returned to a particular hallway near the chamber of lightless pages. He had passed this corridor countless times, but never once paused. Something on that day, perhaps the angle of light or the soft whisper of silence, caused him to glance sideways. There, behind a translucent linen curtain gently swaying in the still air, stood a door made of blackened oak. It bore no markings, only the subtle indentation of a single letter burned into the wood. Lucian hesitated. Then, with no sound, he entered. The room was not grand. It was barely more than a narrow study, stone walls, 2 desks, 3 chairs, and shelves, all covered in a fine layer of pale gray dust. But there was no scent of decay, nor abandonment. Only preservation. The kind of stillness one finds in a room where someone has just stepped out 2 centuries ago. Lucian crossed to the nearest desk. Stacks of parchment lay in neat bundles, some bound in twine, others in silk. Every single one was marked in the lower corner with a small symbol, a triangle enclosing a tiny flame, and beneath it, a signature in faded ink. Archivista. The handwriting was delicate, unwavering, not hurried, not decorative, precise. Lucian opened the first page and began to read. It was not a letter, not a record. It was a description of a room that did not exist, or at least not yet. It described the scent of damp wood, the creak of floorboards aged by footsteps not yet taken, the sound of leaves brushing a glass window no one had ever installed. The parchment went on to catalog a shelf empty, but already filled in memory with volumes about birds that had forgotten how to sing. Another page described a staircase made of fog. Not metaphorically, but literally. Steps that vanished if one tried to count them, but always returned underfoot with trust. Lucian felt something strange. He was not reading a record of what had been, nor a prophecy of what might be. He was reading the echo of potential. The archivist had not recorded history. He had archived possibility. Lucian moved to the second desk. This one was messier, covered in diagrams drawn with charcoal and thin copper wire. There were spirals drawn into circles, circles broken into hexagons, and lists of symbols not found in any known alphabet. One page caught Lucian's eye. It was a list of names, but not of people, of silences. Silence between bells. Silence of forgotten doors. Silence. After laughter, silence. Before naming silence, carried by wind. Each silence was paired with a date, not in the Gregorian calendar, but in something that resembled breath patterns. A slow inhale, a pause, a 3-second exhale. Lucian realized these were not dates at all. They were moments of awareness, measured not in time, but in stillness. He read more. A parchment at the very bottom of the pile bore no markings, no title. But as he touched it, Lucian saw the image of a staircase descending, as if drawn in his mind. And he remembered. There had been a stairwell. Behind the oldest Latin theology section, one he had dismissed as leading to storage. He folded the page, careful not to crease it, and returned the rest to their places. Before he left, he noticed something on the wall. At first, it looked like a crack in the stone, but as he stared, it deepened into lines faint, ancient carvings. And then, as if emerging from dust, a phrase appeared. Archivista non natus, sed notatus. The archivist was never born, but was marked. Lucian felt a chill, not of fear, but of recognition. Somehow, this person, this unseen hand, had existed without existing, had lived in the blank space between one breath and the next. And yet, he had touched everything. Later that day, Lucian returned to the stairwell behind the Latin shelves. It looked like any other servant passage, narrow, cobbled, unlit. He stepped inside. The air changed immediately cooler, but not damp. It felt like entering a wine cellar kept for thoughts instead of bottles. Each step downward echoed twice, once in the stone, once in Lucian's chest. At the base of the stairs, he found a room smaller than the archivist's study, just a circular alcove with no furniture, no shelves, only a pillar in the center. On the pillar was a single object, a quill. Black, made of no bird Lucian could identify. It pulsed faintly with warmth. He did not pick it up. Instead, he knelt and placed both hands on the stone. And in his mind, he heard not words, but a presence. Not a voice, but a rhythm. The quill had written nothing. And yet, every story Lucian had encountered from the lightless pages to the unwritten book bore this same silent authorship. That night, Lucian wrote only this in his journal. The greatest archivist may never write a word. He may only preserve what cannot be remembered. Perhaps I have met him. Perhaps I will become him. Or perhaps I already am. There was a hallway in the Vatican Library that did not appear on any floor plan, any blueprint, or any memory. It was not hidden behind a false wall or concealed by clever mechanisms. It was not even locked. It simply did not ask to be noticed. And so almost no one did. Lucian Aldo found it not through discovery, but through hesitation. He had been walking toward the room of Index Desiderata, a chamber reserved for listing texts that had been lost, stolen, or forbidden, when he paused near a wide arch between two stairwells. The arch bore no inscription, no door, no barrier. Yet something about the space it framed made his breath catch, as though the air beyond had a shape it did not wish to reveal. He stepped through. What met him was not darkness, but something quieter. A corridor stretched into distance without lamps or windows. The walls were lined not with bookshelves, but with recesses, alcoves without contents. They were like niches in a chapel, only they held no statues. And yet, each one hummed faintly, like an echo that had chosen silence over sound. Lucian walked slowly. There was no dust, no scent of age, only the faint vibration of presence, the way one feels when someone is about to speak, but doesn't. He paused at the first alcove. There was nothing visible inside, yet the longer he stood before it, the more he felt a question forming in his chest. It was not articulated. It had no words, but it pressed against his ribs with the weight of something long suppressed. Then he heard it. Not aloud, not from without. From within. Why was I never asked to stay? The voice was not his own, nor was it anyone else's. It was the question itself, longing not for an answer, but for acknowledgement. Lucian stepped back, heart strangely calm. He moved to the next alcove. This one was colder. It carried the stillness of absence. And again, without warning, a question unfurled in his mind. If I had spoken, would you have listened? He walked on, one alcove after another. Each radiated an emotion: grief, regret, wonder, hesitation. The corridor became a procession of sentiments that had never found breath. Not prayers, not confessions, just questions. Unasked, unvoiced, preserved. There was no destination. And yet Lucian walked for what felt like hours. Time did not pass in this hallway the way it did in other wings of the library. Here, moments folded in on themselves, stretched gently across the consciousness like soft fabric catching on wind. Some alcoves bore no voice, but instead gave images a mother at the threshold of a room she dared not enter. A letter never sent. A path turned away from without knowing why. These were not ghosts. They were possibilities deferred. Lucien stopped in the center of the hallway, where the ceiling curved into a dome, painted in a color too subtle to name. In the middle of the floor lay a cushion. Simple, worn, waiting. He knelt, placing his hands on his thighs, palms up. And then the questions came. Dozens, hundreds. Not shouted, not wept, simply offered. Did you ever know what I meant? Was it wrong to stay silent? Why did no one wait for me? Is it possible to be forgotten before being known? They filled the room like breath, each rising and fading without pain. Lucian did not answer. He only listened. He understood then this hallway was not a place of resolution. It was a sanctuary for the right to wonder, a shelter for things that needed no conclusion. He sat in stillness, not meditating, not thinking, only being present with the questions that had been set aside by time. Eventually the voices dimmed. Lucian rose. As he turned to walk back the way he came, the corridor did not end. It simply forgot itself. The arches faded into the familiar halls of the Vatican Library. And when Lucien looked back, there was no doorway, no niche, no sound. But in his pocket, he found a single slip of parchment. It bore one sentence, handwritten in the same delicate ink he'd seen before. Not all questions require answers. Some only require a witness. Lucien folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his journal. He said nothing to the other scholars that evening, nor did he return to the hallway again. But he listened more closely, to silences, to hesitations, to the spaces between words. And in that listening, the world around him began to whisper, not with knowledge, but with invitation. The library had its shadows, but some of them were drawn not by stone or candle, but by memory. Lucien had come to know this well. The deeper he ventured into the archives, the more he felt the architecture of the place change, not in brick or design, but in tone, as though the building adjusted its silence in response to the presence of certain names. One such name was Cardinal Bellator. There were few references to him, no full biography, no formal records of birth or death, just scattered notations in marginalia, references in footnotes, and one locked drawer in the librarian's study, sealed not with a key, but with a handwritten sigil pressed into ancient wax. That seal broke for Lucien on the seventh evening. He had not meant to find it. He had merely been sorting through the lower index of defrocked theologians when a breeze passed behind him. There were no windows open, no doors ajar. But he followed it nonetheless, a trail of still air, leading through 2 reading rooms and into a gallery of cracked frescoes. There he found the drawer, and when he touched it, the wax dissolved. Inside was a single envelope, folded 3 times and tied with a crimson ribbon. The parchment had yellowed, but the ink was crisp. There was no address, no recipient. Only the title, "To the One Who Still Listens." Lucien read. The letter was not dated, and it did not begin with a greeting. It opened with a confession. They never told me what to protect, only that I must never allow it to be revealed. For 40 years, I carried a silence that did not belong to me. The cardinal spoke of a chamber not beneath the library, but within it, a place not constructed but grown. A hollow in the structure that emerged when enough forgetting had taken place around it. He called it the room of sighing walls. There are stones there that murmur, not in Latin, nor in prayer, but in fragments of intent, unspoken wishes that never became action. I have heard them at night. I have heard them say my name. Lucien paused. There had been whispers, faint ones near the Hall of Maps, where he had once brushed against a column and felt a heartbeat not his own. He continued reading. The Church has buried many truths, but not all were lies. Some were simply too tender to survive sunlight. I was told to forget the manuscript. I failed. It is not written in ink. It is not kept in a codex. It lives in the breathing of stone, in the sigh of thresholds. You will find it if you do not seek. The cardinal described a ritual not of magic, but of listening. He had spent 30 years walking the same corridor, silently, every Thursday at dusk, never speaking, never writing, only walking. Until one evening the wall receded. He found a chamber not unlike a crypt, but instead of sarcophagi, there were rows of empty shelves, and on each shelf lay a shadow. Each shadow had a name, not of a person, but of a choice never made. I saw mine that wept, not for what I had done, but for what I had allowed to fade. The letter ended with this: To the one who still listens, keep the silence, but do not let it grow lonely. We were never meant to guard against knowledge. We were meant to hold space for what could not be spoken. Lucien folded the letter. He did not cry. He did not shiver. He simply sat, long after the lamps had dimmed, and let the air of the gallery settle around him like a worn cloak. The next morning, He walked the corridor beside the Hall of Maps. It was Thursday. He said nothing, and he listened. It began with a crack in the wall. Not the kind one sees, but the kind one hears. Lucian had passed the arch dozens of times before. It was unmarked, resting just past the Chamber of Concordances, beside a ladder that led to a gallery no longer catalogued. On this morning, however, something in the corridor had changed. The air pressed differently against his sleeves. The quiet carried a subtle rhythm, not sound. Precisely, but interruption. He stopped walking. Behind the stone molding near the floor, something exhaled. Not a breeze, not a breath, but a sense of having recently remembered something long forgotten. Lucian turned. The wall was smooth, but his fingers, when traced along its edge, felt resistance, as if touching a page that refused to open. And then, with the slightest pressure, the wall moved. It did not swing open, it receded. Beyond it lay a narrow passageway. No wider than a monk's desk, the walls were of older stone, not quarried like the rest of the library, but rougher, like river rock. He stepped inside. There was no light, but there was direction. Lucian followed the curve of the wall for several minutes until the passage widened into a round chamber. He could not say how large it was. The space did not echo. It did not acknowledge its own size. There were no books, no furniture, no decoration. Only stone, old, quiet, and uneven. And in the center, a single stone stool. Lucian sat. He expected thought, but none came. He expected emotion, but it did not rise. Instead, he felt absence. Not void, not emptiness, but the presence of something that once had been and chose to no longer be. It was not sadness. It was peace. He remained there for a long while. Then, slowly, words began to form, not aloud, not written. They rose inside him like a memory misremembered. You have entered the room that forgot its name. Names are bindings. This place wished to remain unbound. He sat still, he listened. Here dwell the ideas that were once understood but never shared. The dreams that woke before being dreamt. The thoughts that touched the edge of speech, but turned back. We are not hidden, we are resting. Lucian looked around. There was still nothing visible, but he began to notice warmth, as though the air held memory like water holds sun. You do not need to stay, but if you do not speak. We are not silence, we are what comes before. And Lucian understood. This room was not meant to be studied. It was not meant to be written about. It was not even meant to be remembered. It was a place where thought released its need to become form, where meaning chose not to anchor itself in symbol. He stayed until the need to name faded. Then he stood, bowed gently, and left. The passage did not close behind him, it simply ceased being there. When he returned to the Chamber of Concordances, no time had passed. No dust clung to his shoes, no memory lingered in his voice. But in his pocket he found a thread of gray wool, old, frayed, and bearing no scent. He kept it without question. Some days later, Lucian tried to write about the room, but his pen would not move. And for the first time, he felt no frustration at forgetting. Only gratitude for the gift of something he did not have to carry, for the space between knowing and needing to know, for the room that had once had a name and had gently chosen to let it go. There was a legend, seldom spoken and even less often believed, about a text in the Vatican Library that had no author. It was not catalogued. It bore no title, no call number, no spine. Yet some said it existed a manuscript that did not appear until someone had truly listened. Lucian had not gone searching for it. In fact, he had long stopped searching at all, after the room that forgot its name. Lucian spent his days walking the quiet aisles with reverence. He touched nothing. He asked for nothing, but he listened. And then, one evening just before dusk, it began. A whisper. Not in his ear, not in the room, but inside the moment. It was a breath shaped like language. He turned, and the light in the corridor dimmed, not from lack of sun, but from a kind of collective pause, as if every page in every book had stopped mid-word to observe. A slip of parchment lay on the floor. He had not seen it fall. No one had walked past. Yet there it was, folded once, resting beside a shelf of medieval commentaries. He knelt and opened it. One sentence. Do not seek to understand, only to receive. The paper was warm. Lucien stood and followed the corridor. He did not know where it led, but his feet moved with quiet certainty. The library was still. The breath of ages hung like velvet in the air. He entered a room he had never seen before. It was round, and in the center was a pedestal. On it rested an open book. The pages turned themselves, not in wind, not by unseen hand. They turned as one might turn in sleep gently, slowly, remembering their dream. Lucien stepped closer. There was no title. The script was fluid, shifting subtly as he read. Each line was written in the same moment he beheld it. He reached no beginning, nor end. Each page spoke not to the mind, but to the breath. The phrases did not hold meaning in the traditional sense. They echoed thoughts he had not yet thought. They framed emotions that had no name. He realized the book was writing him. Every time he inhaled, a line formed. Every time he exhaled, it faded. It was not meant to be kept. It was meant to be experienced. Hours passed, or none at all. Time shed its architecture. Lucien wept, but not from sorrow. He wept because something in him had been seen. Completely. Without judgment. Without interruption. The book turned one final page. A single phrase appeared. The one who listens becomes the one who is heard. Then the book closed. It did not snap shut. It exhaled. Lucien bowed. When he looked up, the pedestal was empty. The room had changed, or perhaps it had remembered itself as something else. There were no walls now, only light. He stood alone, and yet not alone. The whisper still lingered. Not in the air, but in the space between each heartbeat. And when Lucien walked back into the ordinary halls of the library, he carried nothing with him. Not a book, not a parchment, not a relic. Only silence. But within that silence, something had shifted. He no longer needed to ask the question, because he had become the page, and the page had listened. It was neither a room nor a passage, neither catalogued nor sealed. Lucien first glimpsed it not with his eyes, but in the flicker of reflection on an ancient brass plate in the atrium of forgotten cartographies. He had been polishing it absent-mindedly, lost in thought, when a corridor shimmered behind him where none had existed before. He turned. The corridor remained. Long and pale, lined with niches. Every niche held a single card. It looked, at first, like a filing system, until Lucien noticed that the cards were not organized by subject, name, or date. They bore no order the mind could grasp, and none had writing. Not until he touched one. The moment his fingers brushed the edge, ink spilled across the parchment. But it did not form words he recognized. It formed a memory. Not his own, yet somehow known. A mother's lullaby, sung in a language no longer spoken. The feel of morning frost on a stone threshold, before doors had names. A question asked by a child who had not yet been born. Lucien stepped back. The ink faded. He touched another. This time, he felt an oath made beside a riverbank, never spoken aloud, yet kept across centuries. Every card held a fragment not of history, but of the moments beneath it, things unrecorded because they could not be recorded. The index was not of knowledge. It was of meaning. He walked slowly. The corridor curved and continued. There were thousands, no millions of cards. And yet, the corridor never grew oppressive. It breathed. Each step was a question answered and a question born. Lucien sat upon a small bench that appeared just as he needed rest. It was carved of olive wood, bearing no markings, but warm to the touch. Across from him, the wall shimmered. A niche emptied itself. A card floated to his lap. It remained blank. He did not touch it. Instead, he waited. And after a long while, a sentence appeared. The reader becomes the remembered. Lucien nodded. He placed the card back into the niche and continued walking. Hours passed, or days, or none at all. Time in the index was not counted in seconds, but in revelations. He learned that there had once been a name for the color of hope, but it had been spoken only in breath, never in voice. He learned that every silence has a shape. He learned that questions asked without sound echo longer than any bell. Eventually, the corridor narrowed. Not from design, but from invitation. He reached a final alcove, or rather, the place where walking ceased to be needed. There was no door, no gate. Just a final card. It hovered in the air, waiting. Lucien reached out. The moment he touched it, it wrote itself. Thank you for listening. The corridor exhaled, and Lucien was no longer in the index. He stood once again in the oldest reading room of the Vatican Library. The lamps glowed softly. Dust motes floated like prayers in suspension. No one else stirred. In his pocket, he found a single slip of paper. He unfolded it. There was no writing, only the faint warmth of something remembered by the world and forgotten by the mind. Lucien smiled. He returned to his desk. The books waited. He began again, not as a seeker, but as a keeper. Not to record, not to explain, but to remember, for the sake of remembering, and to make space, as the library had always done, for what could not be said, only known. The index had no end, but it did have a reader. The Vatican Library had many doors, but only one that did not open to a place. It was not meant to be noticed, and most never did. In fact, it wasn't a door until it was seen, and even then, only by those who had ceased asking where they were going. Lucien did not find it, he remembered it. The memory came unannounced, in the breath between two thoughts. He had been walking through the marble atrium, past the statue of St. Jerome, when he felt the subtle shift, not a draft, not a sound but a change in tension in the space itself, as though the air was holding its breath. He turned. Where there had only been smooth stone wall, there now stood a door. It had no handle. It bore no inscription. Its wood was dark, older than any construction he had seen in the library. It seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. He stepped closer, and the door opened inward, not into a corridor, but into himself. That was the only way to describe it. He did not walk forward, he was drawn. There was no threshold, there was no floor, only memory. But not memory like a film reel, not linear, not even coherent. It was sensation, layered on sensation. He saw a tree, but not a tree, from any forest he had walked. It was the idea of shelter, of shade, of stories told beneath its branches. He heard voices, but none he could identify. Still, they comforted him. He smelled bread baking, though he had never known hunger in this form. Lucien floated, or rather, he dissolved. Here, identity was not fixed. It was fluid, like ink before it meets parchment. He encountered a child himself, perhaps curled in sleep beneath a quilt of stars. Then an old man with his eyes but fuller, sadder, content. He did not speak. Here, words would have broken the fabric of understanding. He moved through places that were not places, the shadow of a courtyard, never built. The echo of a goodbye, never said. The warmth of hands that had once held his, and would again, though outside of time. It was not a vision, it was being. And it was endless, but not overwhelming. The self he had known, the librarian, the scholar, the listener stepped aside, and something deeper took its place. A presence that did not name, did not sort, did not seek, only witnessed. He saw his own grief, not as pain, but as shape, a valley carved by weather, not malice. He saw his fear, not as failure, but as instinct, the trembling of a branch before the wind. He saw his joy not as possession, but as song, sung once, remembered always. There were others. He passed through fragments of strangers' dreams, a woman who longed to speak to her mother again, a man who had hidden his truth beneath years of silence, a child who had once tried to draw God in chalk. Lucian became each of them, if only for a moment. And in doing so, he let go of the need to understand. He simply was. The door had no exit. It had only return. Not a going back, but a re-emergence. When he finally stepped out, or perhaps when he was reassembled, he stood again in the library. No time had passed. The dust motes still hung in suspension, but he was changed. He did not carry knowledge, he carried compassion, the kind that does not try to fix or name or hold, only to be present. The door no longer stood behind him. He did not need to seek it again, because it now lived inside him, a threshold not to another place, but to a way of being. And from that day forward, Lucian listened differently, not only to the library, but to silence, to sorrow, to the pauses in conversation that say more than speech. He knew the door would open again, not in stone, but in stillness, and he would be ready. It was said there was once a chamber in the Vatican Library that wrote without writers. Not a myth, but not entirely believed either. They called it the scriptorium without scribes, a place where no hands moved, and yet the pages filled themselves. Lucian heard the story from a nun who never raised her voice above a whisper. She spoke of a staircase that only appeared at dawn, beneath a slanted shaft of light in the south cloister. He followed the instructions not out of disbelief, but because the library had taught him long ago that what whispers louder than reason is often what is most true. The light came just as she said, "Go to the stairs." They wound downward, deeper than any floor he had visited. No torches, no lamps. Yet there was no darkness. He arrived in a room of utter stillness. Desks, hundreds of them, arranged in concentric circles, each one empty, except for the parchment and the ink. Lucian approached the nearest desk. The parchment was blank. He sat. Nothing happened. Then, in the far corner of the room, a quill lifted. Slowly, carefully, it dipped itself into the inkpot and began to write. No hand guided it. No figure stood near. It was as if thought alone had stirred it. Lucian approached, breath held. The words that formed were not in Latin, not Greek, not any language he knew. And yet he understood. They were not meant to be read with eyes. They were prayers that had never been prayed aloud. Laments of the heart whispered into nothingness and forgotten. Dreams let go before morning came. Each quill began to move. One by one, a soft rustling filled the space, like snowfall against vellum. Lucian sat at a different desk. This time, as he closed his eyes, his thoughts unspooled not in words but in images. A memory of his mother brushing snow off his shoulders. The sound of an unanswered letter being folded. A word he had once wanted to say but hadn't. When he opened his eyes, the parchment before him was no longer blank. The ink had taken shape, not in script, but in lines and curves that resembled both map and music. It pulsed faintly. He looked around, all across the room. The pages shimmered. This was no archive. This was a mirror. The scriptorium wrote not about people, but from them. From their quietest hours. From their deepest noticings. And the library kept them, not to expose, not to publish, but to honor. To say we remember the things you thought no one heard. Lucian stood, moved deeper into the chamber. At the very center was a pedestal, and on it a bound book. Unlike the others, this one was open, but no ink graced its pages. Just light. Soft, pale, ever-shifting light. He leaned in, and heard not with his ears, but with his sense of being the quiet murmur of every soul that had passed through the library. A gentle chorus of what was left unsaid. He turned a page, the light changed. Now it was the hush of a forest before snowfall. Now the breath of a child falling asleep. Now the silent nod between strangers who recognize each other's sorrow. He closed the book. The light faded, but not entirely. A glow remained in his chest, faint but steady. He walked slowly, passing the desks once more. Many pages now glowed. Some had lifted, floating mid-air like lanterns. He did not take one. He did not need to. He had become part of the writing. And the scriptorium, in turn, had written him. There are substances in the world that remember touch, some that remember scent, and a rare few that remember light. Lucian learned of the ink not through scripture, but through silence. In the eastern wing of the library, beyond the unmarked shelves and behind a fresco, half lost to candle soot, there rested a case. No glass, no lock, just an invitation wrapped in obscurity. He did not open it, it opened to him. Inside, nestled in velvet, darker than shadow, was a small vial, no label, no seal, just a shimmer at the edge of perception. It pulsed faintly when touched, as though it breathed. He lifted it gently. The ink was pale, not black or blue or red, but something that looked like memory caught in liquid. Next to it a quill, not feather, not metal, carved from something like bone or perhaps root. It felt warm. There was no instruction, only space. He found an empty desk. The parchment there was translucent, almost not there. Lucian dipped the quill and wrote. At first, nothing. Then, a glow soft as morning mist, lines unfolding not in ink but in light. His hand moved of its own accord, or rather, the part of him that had no name did the writing. What appeared on the page was not script, but shape, not language, but memory. He saw a hill he had never climbed, yet knew. A hand he had never held, yet mourned. A goodbye that had never been spoken, but always waited. The ink recalled not facts, but feelings. It remembered the way light had fallen in a room now gone, the laughter that once filled a stairwell, the hush before a question that was never asked. Lucian turned the page. He dipped the quill again. Another image formed a small kitchen at dusk, the smell of citrus peel, the sound of cloth being folded, the quiet breath of someone lost in thought. And then without effort, without design, the parchment shimmered, and the image lifted from the page. It did not become real, but it became present. Around him, the desk flickered. For a moment, he sat in that memory not as himself, but as presence, witness. It was not his memory, nor anyone else's. It simply was. The ink did not distinguish between lives. It remembered what light had touched across time, across longing, across silence. He turned another page. He saw war, but not the violence, only the pause before it began. He saw love, but not the romance, only the reaching. He saw death, but not the ending, only the closing of eyes with gratitude. Each page became a window, and then a mirror, and then neither. The book grew heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. Lucian paused. The ink within the vial shimmered lower, its memory fading. Or complete. He returned the vial to its cradle. Immediately, the glow around him dimmed. But something remained. His hand still held warmth not his own. His mind still echoed with colors he could not name. He closed the book gently. The parchment faded to transparency. The desk now seemed ordinary. But Lucian was not, for he had touched something beyond story. He had written not with thought, but with remembrance. And the ink, in turn, had written him back. Later, when he looked in the mirror, his eyes held light. Not reflected, remembered. Long before Lucian, long before the shelves reached their winding spines toward heaven, there were voices that walked together in silence. The Vatican Library had always held more than books. It held pairings not of volumes, but of souls, bound not by blood, but by the invisible thread of knowing. It began one evening, when Lucian noticed two shadows where there should have been one. He was alone in the eastern alcove, brushing dust from a neglected folio, when he felt the twin presence, not ominous, not cold, just present, as if someone else were breathing the same rhythm. He turned. No one. But in the lantern glow cast upon the wall, two silhouettes. He did not move, and neither did they. Instead, they shifted together as if swaying to a sound no ear could register. Lucian closed the book. The silence deepened. And then he heard it not a voice, but a space between sounds. The hush between inhale and exhale. A pause so full, it pressed gently against his ribs. 2 steps forward. The light flickered, the shadows followed. The silence impossibly grew louder. Not oppressive, but alive. It led him toward the oldest wing the section few entered. Even fewer remembered. There, at the arch marked only by a faded carving of 2 joined hands. He paused. The air shimmered slightly. He stepped through. Inside a long, narrow chamber, no shelves, no parchment, only benches, placed in pairs. Each pair faced inward like old friends. Lucian sat. Opposite him no one, yet he felt the bench across warm as if recently vacated. He waited. The silence changed. It began to speak. Not in language, but in presence. He felt not saw moments unfolded. A teacher and pupil, hands brushing over a shared map. 2 lovers, forehead to forehead, laughing at nothing. An old priest and a child, both weeping, neither ashamed. Each bench held memory, not just one, but 2. And together, they wove meaning that could not exist alone. Lucian sat in each pair, slowly, reverently, and with every silence, a story. A conversation left unfinished. A promise made without words. A goodbye without departure. When he reached the final bench, he felt his chest tighten. This one was his. And the one opposite, though unseen, knew him. Knew the weight he had carried without complaint. The questions he had never dared voice. The ache of being both surrounded by stories, yet voiceless in his own. Lucian did not cry. He did not speak. He simply sat, and was understood. The silence around him swelled not to fill, but to hold. And in that moment, something ancient and unseen pressed gently into his palm, not an object, but a recognition. He was not alone. He had never been. The library had always spoken in pairs. Because even silence listens best when shared. Lucian stood. As he left the chamber, he no longer cast 2 shadows. But he carried one within, and it walked beside him, always a quiet presence, echoing not in steps but in stillness. The kind of stillness that speaks volumes. Together, they listened. To the pages. To the dust. To each other. The end of all maps is not an edge, but an absence. Lucian had stopped searching. Not because the library had run out of mysteries it hadn't. Not because he no longer believed he did, more than ever, but because one morning, he simply knew. The journey had brought him full circle, and now, someone waited. He returned to the first quarter he had ever walked as a novice, where the walls still held the smell of ink and time, where the lanterns flickered like memory itself. He passed shelves he once thought ancient, now childlike in comparison. There, between 2 forgotten columns, was the blank wall. Not hidden, Not guarded, just waiting. He touched it, and it softened. No door, no hinges, but it let him through. Inside a room so still it felt untouched by breath. The walls were not walls but folds of parchment. The ceiling not stone but sky, dim and deep. The floor not marble but sand, warm and silent. There was nothing. And everything? In the center a chair. Simple, wooden, empty. He sat, and the room began to remember. Not him, but itself. Light unfurled from nowhere and everywhere. The parchment walls rippled. Not with wind, but with stories. Thousands, millions. Not told, not read, but felt. Every silence that had ever been honored. Every shadow that had ever offered shelter. Every question that had found no answer, but still mattered. Lucian closed his eyes. The chair breathed beneath him. And then, across from him, another chair appeared. Occupied, not by a figure, but by presence. Familiar, warm. It carried every librarian who had ever walked these halls. Every soul who had dared to ask quietly. Every voice that had whispered instead of shouted. Lucian spoke no words. And still, he was heard. A final page rose between them. Blank, weightless. He reached for a quill that was not there, but was, and he wrote. Not with ink, not with light, not with memory, but with belonging. The line he wrote was neither beginning nor ending. It was a turning, a fold, a gentle breath in the archive of everything. When he finished, the page did not fall. It hovered, then dissolved, not into dust, but into hush. Lucian stood. The second chair remained. Always would. He stepped outside the room with no door. Behind him, the wall returned, but not to conceal. To cradle. The library did not close. It became wherever someone listened deeply, wherever a question was asked in stillness, wherever a page remained blank with wonder. The room would open, even without doors, even without names. And Lucien. He returned to the shelves, to the dust, to the gentle catalogue of longing. Not to seek, but to accompany. For the library was never about answers, only presence. And it had always known his name,